Can we afford to help? Can the UK afford to help the refugees coming to Europe from Syria and other countries in the Middle East? Or would this strain the resources of the country? When asking what we can afford, we can first look at the actual cost, then at the potential cost, and we'll consider the potential cost of helping compared to other costs we take on, and compared to costs borne by other less wealthy nations. And through these comparisons, you can see that we certainly can afford to do much more than we are now doing. Currently, the Conservative government has ruled that only 20,000 refugees will be allowed into Britain before 2020. That is such a small intake of people that its impact on our economy is completely negligible, almost unmeasurable. The impact of this relatively small number of people is eclipsed by much more significant factors that are at play in determining the strength of the UK economy, such as, for instance, the stability of the country's commercial relations with other European countries in the context of Brexit. But would the UK be able to afford to take in many more refugees? Let's suppose that we were to take in 300,000 people seeking asylum. That's roughly the maximum number that we could take in according to another rule that the government has put in place, a formula that limits the number of refugees that can live in any one town or city so that it doesn't exceed a ratio of 1 per 200 citizens. People might worry that taking in more refugees would put a strain on other social infrastructure, such as the NHS and the education system. If Britain were to increase its intake of refugees to 300,000, then yes, this would mean that for every 200 potential patients in the NHS and every 200 pupils in our schools, we would have to provide for one more. That is a small cost, but we are a wealthy country. It is true that currently these institutions, particularly the NHS, is under a lot of stress, but that is unequivocally because the government has underfunded these services. It is not because, as a country, we cannot afford to fund them properly, nor is it because we've been overwhelmed by immigrants. We plainly haven't. To get a sense of the scale of the cost, it's also worth considering the impact of taking 300,000 refugees in the context of the problem of the UK's ageing population. Consider the impact on the NHS in the UK. People are living longer, and the birth rates are lower than they once were. That means that as time goes on, there'll be a significantly higher proportion of older people in the population. People who are retired are likely to be contributing less to the economy and are more likely to require healthcare. This is a long-term demographic change in the UK that within the next 2 decades is going to put tens of billions of pounds of extra pressure on the Treasury. In comparison, the upfront cost of housing as many as 300,000 refugees would only run to the tens of millions. And of course, even this upfront cost is misleading, since many refugees will be economically active. Many of those who remain residents here will end up contributing more through taxes than was spent on offering them a home in the first place. The reason that we should help refugees, fundamentally, is because we can, and they need us to. But the UK could well also experience a long-term economic benefit from those refugees who come to the UK and decide to stay and raise families here. But ultimately, there is a different and perhaps more important way of thinking about the question of whether we can afford to help. That is, rather than asking whether the cost to us will be bearable, we can ask how well placed we are to meet that cost compared with other countries who will otherwise be called on to assist the millions of people who've been displaced. When you think of things this way, it is striking that Britain currently houses less than 1% of the world's refugees, despite being its 5th largest economy. Even more striking, perhaps, is that the vast majority of the world's refugees, 86%, are now living in far poorer developing countries. In this light, it is clear that as one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we are capable of providing a home to a far greater share of those fleeing war than we currently are. We can afford to help, and we're well placed to do so.